Further debate? The member for York Simcoe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak to Bill 18, an act to amend various statutes with respect to employment and labour. Before I begin an examination of the bill itself, I'd like to just comment on the fact that this bill is really two-in-one. In the previous legislative session, there were two very separate bills, one that addressed the minimum wage issue, Bill 165, and another that addressed issues related to employment and labour, Bill 146. Bill 18 combines these bills, which I'm not sure I'm comfortable with, as these are two distinct issues. I think it's important to understand that in a productive debate, you want a bill that addresses a specific issue rather than several. One of the reasons is that it cuts the time in half, as we should be giving equal consideration to both parts of the bill. My colleague from Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox and Addington has suggested an amendment to separate these two issues into separate bills so that we can focus our debates as opposed to having an omnibus that we are unable to give proper consideration. This bill, this being said, I will deal with both parts of the bill today in my remarks. The first issue then is the question of the minimum wage. And the minimum wage was raised without any kind of rational basis this past June. And the bill then sets out a predictable timetable for businesses for increasing the minimum wage. Now, originally, when the government consulted with particularly small business, the request was with regard to a predictability with the idea of every 2 years, not every one. And the predictability then was to be based on this review that would be tied to inflation. And I think all of us can understand why a 2-year span is preferable than one. Obviously, an annual increase is causes the overall rate to increase at a faster pace than 2 years. The other is that the average of 2 years inflation is likely to be a smaller amount. And annual increases, particularly in small businesses, become just that much more non-billable time, quite frankly, by the extra paperwork that goes with it. And so the effect of providing this to businesses, whilst it gave them the surety of it being tied to the CPI, the Canada Index, at the same time, it is an annual thing, and that is certainly a different kind of pressure for businesses. It'll mean the cost of doing business will increase at a faster rate, and that businesses will have less time to smooth out the financial adjustments that are required to be able to meet the changes. Well, minimum wage is a very controversial issue because, as with so many things, it depends on whose shoes you're in. The danger, can I get a glass of water, please? The danger is that an employer is faced with problems with regard to being able to afford this. And so very often people find themselves in the position that they either have to reduce hours or they reduce jobs to meet this new hurdle. And so then it defeats the purpose of providing an opportunity for people when in fact they may lose employment as opposed to having an increase. When we look at the group of the population that we're looking at for minimum wage, there's different categories, and the largest category is actually young people who go home. They're providing a service, they're getting the experience of their first job, they're gaining important work experience, and quite frankly, that's more important at this point than what their pay is. And employers recognize that. I talked to an individual in my riding who's been a great source of employment for young people, and he's always made a place for them. But when the increases of minimum wage come along, he has to get out and sharpen his pencil. And I'll tell you why. Because he can hire, say, 3 students. It's their first job. They're going to require greater training, greater supervision, but it's good experience. And in a couple of years, they'll be really good employees. But he's got a choice. If minimum wage, just for example, is $10 and he has 3 students for approximately $30, he can have 2 adults for $14 or $15 who require no commensurate supervision, who take their job seriously, that get it done, that are more reliable, don't come late, don't forget their shift and things like that. So for employers, there comes a point of really making a judgment call as to whether or not it serves their particular business to have those 3 young people or not. So we have that group, and then a smaller but significant group are new immigrants, and they of course are looking for entry-level jobs. It may be to enhance their facility in English. It may be to get references and so forth. But those 2 groups are people that are looking at entry-level jobs that have minimum wage. So the question of raising minimum wage is also something that is viewed by other sectors in the workforce, and that is the people that have contracts that set their wages at a certain percent above minimum wage. So it makes wage negotiations a really easy thing to do, because if you always have, let's say, 4% above minimum wage or 6% or something like that, now you have a very strong bargaining position to be able to go in and say, I need more money. And again, we come back to the business, and the business having to make that decision in terms of what can they afford, how many people can they afford. Those are very serious issues in the workplace. And so it also means that obviously we have to deal with the fact that minimum wage jobs should be entry-level jobs. And that's really what the purpose is for. It's to provide a baseline income for people entering the workforce. It is important to protect workers' rights and ensure that employees, especially those who have no prior work experience, are not being taken advantage of by employers. Jobs that offer minimum wage are meant, as I said, to be a starting off point. In some cases, in Ontario, minimum wages have become a career-long wage. And this is more common in Ontario than in any other province. And I think it's important to note that this should obviously not be the case, and it speaks to the broader issue of just how high the minimum wage is or should be. Ontario is the only province since 2003 that has tripled the percentage of those in the workforce in minimum wage positions. That's very significant that it's tripled the percentage. It now stands at almost 10% of our workforce making minimum wage, or over 500,000 people. 500,000 people are making minimum wage, hundreds of thousands of more people than when the Liberals came into office. This brings me to another point. Here on this side of the House, we have been asking the government what they are doing to promote the increase of good jobs in this province. Just yesterday, the Premier said in the House during question period, and I quote, "I actually believe that fiscal prudence and a strong economy are connected." Well, Mr. Speaker, I think we have our answer here. Fiscal prudence? What fiscal prudence? No wonder we have such a weak economy and a shortage of good jobs, because the Liberal government for over a decade has dug us into a deeper economic hole than we've ever seen. And I think it's important to put this conversation about Bill 18 into that broader context of the economy. And so I'm going to provide you with some statistics that I think are definitely earmarks for what we're looking at. In 2009, the deficit was $19.3 billion, and unemployment in this province was 9%. In the national rate of unemployment, it was 8.3. Now, there isn't a test at the end, so you don't have to remember these. But I do think it's important to see the kind of trend when you look over the last few years. If we jump to 2011, the deficit, $13 billion, unemployment had dropped to 7.8, but the national unemployment rate was 7.4. In 2012, the deficit was $9.2 billion. The unemployment rate remained at 7.8, and the national unemployment rate was 7.2. In 2013, the deficit had gone back up, $10.5 billion, unemployment 7.5, the national unemployment rate 7.1, the lowest of the period of time. In 2014, we have a deficit of at least $12.5 billion, and we are not quite sure because there are anticipated asset sales. We just don't know how many times they've been counted. Not only has Ontario's economy been suffering because of this government's policies, the government continues to make it difficult for businesses to run in this province due to red tape and payroll taxes. I think that probably if I were to ask any of the small businesses in my riding, they would talk about red tape. My favourite story is one where ministries can't agree on the rules. I have two businesses. One has a door, and one ministry says it swings this way, the other ministry says it swings the other way. I have another constituent trying to make a living who has the Ministry of Health, two different departments, and they can't agree on the level of chlorine that is appropriate. So everywhere you go, you get that constant refrain of, let us do our job. We can actually make money if you leave us alone and we can move along ahead with our business. And they're not saying that because they cut corners on health or safety or anything like that. It's because it's a new set of rules at a pace that makes it very difficult for them to make any money and therefore pay taxes. People forget businesses have to make a profit. That's the only way that government survives. And the other issue, of course, is the question of the tax burden. And this minimum wage, of course, comes out of the pocket of the business, and so it is, in fact, the same thing as a payroll tax. The credit rating agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor know this, that the province of Ontario is going to have to eliminate the budget. And after several warnings, the agencies seem ready to downgrade Ontario. If Ontario's rating goes down, the deficit will grow even faster because our borrowing costs will increase by at least 1 percentage point, which amounts to at least $500 million a year increase to the deficit. So a higher government deficit equals a more fragile economy. Mr. Speaker, over the last number of years, I have spoken with hundreds of small business owners and their representatives from affiliated associations, and I've heard the same type of stories over and over again. Most businesses, especially small businesses, have had to face dozens of regulations by a number of agencies, boards, and commissions, which all have different rules and standards, which sometimes conflict with each other. It takes hours and hours for businesses to deal with the agencies, boards, and commissions, and the numerous job-killing regulations that they face. In 2012, the Ontario Home Builders Association, as an example, said there were 28 agencies, boards, and commissions that home builders have to deal with. That's a bit like having 28 bosses. Which one takes precedence over which? Think about the time it would take to deal with all of these, let alone deal with day-to-day business operations. Just dealing with regulation comes to be a full-time job. Not only are businesses hit with red tape, they also have to worry about payroll tax. The most recent tax that businesses have to figure out is the government's proposed Ontario Retirement Pension Plan, which will add even more expenses in the future, reduce their bottom line, and jobs will surely be lost. This isn't my opinion. This is the sentiment of Ontario's small businesses and associations, including hundreds of local chambers across the province that have created a coalition to deal with this new proposed pension plan, the details of which we are eagerly waiting. Mr. Speaker, in order to have more jobs, we need a better economy. In order to have a better economy, we must make Ontario a good place to do business. I know that yesterday the Minister of Economic Development bragged about how very well small businesses are doing in Ontario. Well, I'm not sure I can agree with him on this point. If Ontario's environment was so conducive to economic success and job creation, why have we had a higher unemployment rate than the rest of Canada for the last 5 years? And why do I hear from businesses and industries almost on a daily basis how hard it is to do business in Ontario? And these are hardly the comments you hear from people who are comfortable with government policies. I know the Liberals like to pride themselves on their accomplishments, but the reality is we live in a province where too many people rely on minimum wage. Minimum wage is meant to be a temporary measure, not a permanent career-long wage. It is also a costly measure that promotes the hiring of fewer people. So the important thing here as we look at this bill is to look at beyond the bill and what are the implications and how does it benefit the people of Ontario. And keeping in mind that we have large segments of business that have left. Caterpillar, Heinz, Stelco, these are names that have always made a huge contribution to the employment in this province. We have to make sure we can continue the tradition of excellence and move forward. Thank you.
Good job.